So today we're going to be talking about the oil crisis.
Won't the oil crisis be miraculously solved or already have been miraculously solved by the time this comes out? But aren't there
Well,
concepts of a plan? Hello and welcome to the Transport Leaders Podcast, a podcast about everything transport, engineering and policy. I'm Graham McCabe and I'm a transport planning and traffic engineer with 30 years experience in Australia and the Asia Pacific.
And hello, I'm Russell King. I'm a transport strategist. I've got 20 years experience doing transport policy.
And what are we going to talk about today, Russell?
Well, we thought we'd be a little bit topical, Graham, today. So today we're going to be talking about the oil crisis. What did we do when there was a really significant oil crisis? And what are we doing today to respond to the oil crisis? And what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong?
Won't the oil crisis be miraculously solved or already have been miraculously solved by the time this comes out? But aren't there
Well,
concepts of a plan?
if you're intending on editing this episode at about 2029, possibly. Otherwise, no. We will be in an oil crisis for quite a few weeks and months to come, even if they manage to reopen the Strait of Hormuz today, which is when we're recording, which is the 7th of April. We will have a significant problem for the next few months.
Yeah. So it's the 7th of April, Australia, not the US. So given that the current US president said that he's going to start doing things at 8 p.m. on Tuesday, American time, we may have to re-record because there may be no more oil. 30% less coming out of the Arabian Peninsula. 30% of global total. Okay. All right. So,
well, the good news is the Ukrainians are also knocking out the Russian oil over the weekend as well. So 30% seems generous.
Yeah.
There's a loss right now. Anyway, we'll see how we go.
Yeah. So we've been through oil crises before. So late 1970s, when OPEC decided to put pressure on the West and basically turned off the taps. We've had driver strikes, truck driver strikes, train driver strikes, which have stopped the movement of oil and fuel. So what's different about this time around?
Well, before we sort of talk about what's different this time around, perhaps let's talk about how we responded in the 1970s to these things.
So, yeah, the 1970s, very similar to now. History rhymes rather than repeats. Car sizes were inflating very rapidly. I mean, if you think about, the 1950s, 1960s, big American Cadillac it wasn't like SUVs now, but cars were getting bigger and bigger. Fuel efficiency wasn't a problem because there was an abundance of petrol or gas, so you didn't have to worry about these things. And cars were, using a lot of fuel. 15, 20 liters per 100 kilometers.
Yeah, and I think this is a really.
Yeah.
So just on this point. So one of the things I think that we learned from that oil crisis in the 70s, which had a lasting legacy, was there was a move to smaller cars, right?
And fuel
efficiency. Yeah. All right. So there was a big drive on that. And that was that was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just Australia or US or UK. It was a global phenomenon. We saw more fuel efficient cars and fuel efficiency became much more important on it.
Yes. I think, and it was one of the things that drove the rise of the Japanese car industry, because in Japan, given the compact nature of the cities and just in general, cars were small and fuel efficient. So the Japanese car manufacturers leapt on the opportunity and made a massive inroad in all the parts of the world where previously you had, tank-sized cars.
Yes. So, and that was a long-term impact, right? And it wasn't necessarily one that was government-led. It was just, I use the word advisedly, market-led, right? People responded to the oil crisis by demanding more fuel-efficient cars.
Yeah. And, well, if you have fuel rationing, either in terms of just the amount you can buy or you can only refuel your car based on the last digit or letter of your number plate, then you start looking for ways of conserving that fuel.
Yes. So
driving less, changing to a smaller more efficient vehicle, and it had long-term behavioral changes.
Yeah. So let's just stick on this point then about and how what it looks like today. So fuel efficiency isn't likely to be the way we respond this time, is it? Because there's something that's come along that's more important in some aspects, such as climate change, for removing fuel efficiency.
Well, yeah. So it's going from molecules to electrons, and
Yes.
yeah, to I drove down last weekend, drove down the New South Wales coast and then inland to Canberra, so 500-kilometre trip. And the road between the coast and Canberra on a Sunday afternoon is normally full of Canberrans going back to their home from being on the coast. The road was empty. No, no traffic that you would actually even consider, to be, having a congestive effect that you would normally see
Yeah.
on a
So
weekend.
the increases in fuel prices is having a significant impact on people's behaviors, not just
Yes.
in terms of switching mode, but actually in terms of how far they're willing to drive.
Uh, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, whereas when you go electric, it basically is negligible cost. So to give, context, my energy bill, um, so that's all including transport for the last 30 days is $43. And that's including driving about 2,000 kilometers in that time.
Yeah. And that's partly because you've got a solar array on your roof,
I've
I'm
got
guessing.
solar, battery, and electric cars, 2 electric cars.
Yeah. So you've gone the full suite.
Yeah, and heat pump hot water. So there's no fossil fuels. So I'm personally
You're very
unaffected
green.
um, by the well, it's very green, but it's very energy independent. So I will be affected by the effects on the broader economy because so much of everything is dependent on fossil fuels. Basically, any food that I get comes from is
Yes.
transported by fossil fuels at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's, I think, very interesting from an economic perspective compared to the 1970s in this space is that the economies were much more dependent on fossil fuels in the 1970s than they are today. Even though we're very dependent on fossil fuels for transport, we're much less dependent on them for the general economy than we were back in the
Yes.
1970s. So the wider economic impacts will probably be less, although there are significant bottleneck issues in certain areas, which we might get onto.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and just for example, the East Coast electricity grid in Australia, basically 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, is 90% renewable energy at the moment.
Yeah. And some of the early indications I'm hearing are that demand for electric vehicles in the last few weeks has significantly increased.
Yeah, though I track this. The ACT, so where Canberra is the leader in terms of percentages in Australia, and the increase was marginal. I would say it was no more than what's actually occurring as part of just the general growth in electric vehicles.
Did you see any
So
of the data for the
there's a bit
US
of
at
there's
all?
a bit of hype
Okay.
going on.
Are you seeing any of the data for the US at all? Or is it just the
No,
Australia
no.
data that you've been tracking?
Yeah, it's just the Australian data that I'm tracking because using it for forecast and modeling. But ACT is the first to come out with their data each month. So there's a
Okay.
difference between sales and registrations. So the
Yeah.
data that comes from the industry is sales, not actual registrations.
Yes. So for our lay listeners, can you explain the difference?
Yeah, okay. So sales data is, well, I've paid the money for the vehicle, put down the
Yeah.
deposit, it's listed as a sale on the books. It doesn't mean I'm driving it around. It's not until it's registered with the motor vehicles agency and in my hands that it's actually a vehicle that's contributing to any change in fuel
Yeah.
usage.
And one of the things we have is often there's a backlog in Australia, or certain post COVID, there was significant lag between purchasing a vehicle and the delivery, and therefore being able to register to drive the vehicle. And that was often, we're not talking like a couple of weeks, we were talking 6 months plus.
Yes, I waited 9 months.
Yeah.
So,
I don't
or
know
the
what the
second elect.
I don't know what the current numbers are like, but yes, there's a lag between the two, which means that because we're still at the beginning or early stages of this crisis, even if you purchase one now, you're not going to get your electric vehicle for quite a while,
Yeah.
especially if there's a
So
surge in sales.
the other type of electric vehicle is also self-reporting, which uptick. So I'm talking electric bikes, larger
Mm.
uptick. But but again, then when you look at the data from cycleway counters, a very mixed bag. So there was an article in the Australian version of the Guardian newspaper about the increase in cycling in Sydney, and then they showed the month-on-month change in people cycling, and it wasn't actually that. I don't think it was statistically significant, based on permanent counters that Sydney has. So the it's very easy to get caught by the hype.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting just on this topic, if you look at London's journey from being a very car dependent city up until sort of the 1990s, even though it had a very extensive public transport system, in the 2000s, it then had a surge in public transport, mostly because of improvements to, well, both the tube in terms of reliability and investment, but also buses in particular. And then the surge for cycling came sort of the late 20 noughties and then into the 2010s and has continued now into the mid 2020s. What's interesting though is that people very rarely switched from the car to the cycle. It tended to be from car to public transport to cycling. And so, and part of that is, I think that, London didn't have the cycling infrastructure to enable people to use the cycle until relatively recently. And I think that's true in somewhere like, well, quite frankly, every city in Australia's cycling facilities are pretty weak and pretty poor. And so people are not going to switch from the car to the cycle very often. I think it'll be more about switching from the car to public transport, especially when you think that Tasmania and Victoria have just gone with free public transport as well. So the incentive to switch from the car to public transport was already high from high fuel prices, and now it's probably even higher because of the free public transport. And we'll get on to whether that's a good idea. So I think that I'm not surprised that cycling doesn't get supercharged unless you put in the infrastructure or do
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yes. Yeah. So, if you think about the COVID, response, putting in cycling infrastructure at that point in time was very much about reducing the number of people on public transport so that you could have the social distancing that
Yep.
was required. And when I ran the business case for the inner city cycle strategy, one of the key things was about reducing pressure on public transport. That if you free up demand in inner areas by moving people who are using public transport from short trips to cycling, then that creates more overall space within the system for people who are making longer trips.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things about electric cars is, certainly in the Australian context, and I'm sure it's everywhere around the world, people who are forced by circumstances to commute by car have been the ones who have been having the highest shift to electric cars prior to this. So people who are paying the most in fuel before the oil crisis were the ones who were most likely to, if they could afford it, to shift to electric car vehicles.
Yeah. So the price signal was already sending that message.
Yeah, and there was government incentives but at the other end of the income scale, it's people who are most dependent on cars because they don't have added value of good public transport services, and they're living in low density areas who are being squeezed the most by the current situation.
Yes. And the problem I think we have is that we've known this for a long time if you're in the transport space, that car dependency is very expensive for those people, regardless of the fuel price, right? Even before the current fuel increases, we knew that car dependency for people on low incomes was eating up a very large proportion of their household income.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, because
And
areas with good public transport, property values are higher.
yes, that's right. Yeah. And they also tend to be more central into cities and, these days central centers of cities are very desirable places to live, and so they're much more expensive as a result. And so you get all of those problems. And so what you got people we've created and designed our cities for people, to be car dependent, for people, disproportionately in the way for people on low incomes are car dependent. And then fuel crisis comes along and they are absolutely hammered, but it's due to our really poor planning, insufficient public transport, the combination of the land use and the impact that has on the transport options we can provide affordably is a killer. Whether we will learn
Yeah.
from that this time, we've been pushing this barrel for a long time, but it's been exposed for a long time now. I think although most urban planners would agree that it's a problem, I think politically it's much easier to build on greenfield, and so that's what we've continued doing.
Yeah. Well, there's also more, you're externalizing the long-term costs by
Absolutely.
if you're the property developer. So, you're creating a maintenance problem for future taxpayers rather than current property purchasers.
Well, and it's also that you're absolutely right. We subsidize the infrastructure for greenfield substantially, and in particular, we make the roads free at the point of use. So people pay for the cost of that, infrastructure. The maintenance and stuff ongoing is paid only partially by the people who are using it. It's paid by, the community as a whole. It's another strong argument of why road pricing would have provided very good signal for people. Don't buy in greenfield areas and be car dependent. And people would have made different choices, and the demands the developers would have developed instead would have been, the properties that developed would have developed. Yeah, the properties that
Yeah.
developers would have developed instead would
On
be very
that,
different.
on that sidetrack note, given that a road price is a long-term signal, I don't think it would actually change people's views on whether to buy in greenfields, because you're paying the road price as you use it. You would, I think it would not change people's attitudes significantly, because the number of people who think about the total cost of ownership of a house plus vehicle would be very, very, very small percentage.
It's an interesting one. I'd love to see the research, because in Sydney's case, we already have toll roads, right? And so I'd be interested to see whether the impacts of toll roads, often new roads, the toll roads, had an impact on housing distribution. Did it increase distribution? Did it increase demand in those areas, or did it decrease? And can you tease out the difference between the toll and the new road and the impact that it has? It's a very interesting question. I know what you mean, but I think at the margins it would make a difference. How substantial it would be, I agree. It's only a very small proportion of the total cost, right? And the reason that one of the big reasons that people are moving out to the greenfield is they get much bigger property for the same amount of money that they can afford.
All right, getting back to the topic. All right, so we've got a crisis. You're a political person. Are we making things better with this crisis? Are we using the opportunity?
Well, let's start with the biggest challenge that we have is, and I think the context is really important here, is that things like fuel crises are a disaster for governments, not just the people, because they tend to, when you have a crisis like this, people tend to lose the next election, right? Regardless of whether they're at fault or not, they lose the next election. And so in many ways, politicians need to respond and need to be seen to be responding. And when you look at the polling of the electorate and you ask them, what do you want? They want lower fuel prices, right? And so the governments feel obliged. And so the first policy lever they pull to is, we'll reduce the taxes that we're imposing on fuel prices. And that's what we're seeing in Australia, but it's also seen in other parts of the world as well. Now, the problem with that, as economists will tell you, is when there's a shortage, as there is globally, and that's why the price is being driven up, the best thing to do is let the price mechanism do its job and allow people to, respond to the price signal, either by reducing the amount they travel, changing their modes. And the people who get the most value out of needing to drive, etc., will pay that price because they have to. But that's the best way of reducing demand for the. So what you don't want to do is distort the price signal and increase demand as a result, because you're already in a shortage. And so what I think will happen, in Australia, is you lower the price through reducing it on taxes. So demand will either be sustained or increased compared to what it would have done otherwise. And so you're exacerbating the shortage, which then means prices are a bit higher anyway. And so you don't get the full benefit of the the tax saving. And if the shortage is bad enough, you won't get any of the tax, any of the savings from the reduction in taxes. So we are probably exacerbating the shortage. The data I heard last time over the weekend was that demand compared to 12 months ago for fuel is currently 30% higher because people are panic buying. And that's part of the reason that Australia is struggling, is the panic buying aspect of it. But that's because people are expecting to have a shortage. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have a shortage because 30% more demand is available, is needed to compensate for the fact people think it's going to be a shortage.
Yeah, well, it's toilet paper all over again.
It is.
I've admittedly living in a regional city, but also traveling a bit lately. I have paid attention to what's been going on at service stations in passing. And I've seen one service station that temporarily ran out of fuel, but they were on the lower price side in comparison to other ones in the lead up to that. So there was, queuing going on at that particular location. So short term discounts from government, they make government's budgetary position worse. They incentivize purchasing because it's a short-term discount. So you want to make sure that you get your fair share before the short-term discount ends. There's also price hikes have a downturn effect on the economy, which doubles the budgetary issue.
I mean, the thing I would say is
cutting investment in roads in order to, pay for this somehow.
I suspect not.
All right. Okay. So government at a national level in Australia is responsible for fuel taxes. So then at a state level, we've got two of the states have made
Let's just finish
transport free.
Let's just finish on the piece. I think it's fair to say that reducing fuel prices is very popular with the public through, reducing taxes, right? But it's really bad policy, right? So it makes things worse, okay? But it is popular. And that's why, it's very attractive to governments to do. So have we made the right response? Probably not.
I know how to solve this. We have a national address from the Prime Minister to tell us not to panic.
Well, I think it's fair to say that globally, some of our leaders have interesting styles when it comes to national addresses, some of them underwhelming, some of them full of expletives. Let's leave it at that for now, okay, and focus on the policy aspects of the oil crisis.
Well, that is a policy, isn't it? I suppose it's politics, telling people not to panic.
Yeah, don't panic. Okay, now I'm panicking, right?
Yeah.
Which is what's basically happened in Australia, right? We don't have any faith in our politicians. That's why we're buying 30% more fuel, because we were storing it up just in case, right? Nobody wants to be caught short because we don't believe we don't believe the reassurances that there are no shortages and that we have supply for the next month or so, at least.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's the first point. Second point, let's get on to the next policy. I think you're absolutely right. Public transport fares. So go on. What were you going to say?
Yeah. So Victoria and Tasmania, two of the states. So the second largest state by population and smallest state by population have both made public transport free. Queensland already has the 50-cent fares. There's increasing pressure on the other states and territories to do the same. Now, as an aside, just going back to the issue of, public transport fares, which we've talked about on another podcast, I reckon in Tasmania, the cost of enforcement and collection is actually higher than the revenue that they've been generating anyway. So Tasmania is probably actually a case where free public transport isn't actually going to hurt the finances of the public transport system. But it's, I think we both agree that giving everybody free fares is bad policy.
Okay, why do you think it's bad policy? I agree with you. We both do agree with this, but why do you think it's bad policy?
Okay. So I can afford to pay public transport fares. The blanket approaches subsidize well-off people more than the value that's derived to the community from it.
So it's really expensive.
Yeah.
It's really expensive, and so it's very poor value in terms of targeting the people who need it most. In fact, if anything, public transport disproportionately benefits people on higher incomes because it's typically used by people who are commuting into higher value city-based jobs.
Yeah. And it's the same with the lower fuel prices. If the government went, oh, this is really hurting poor people in regional areas or disadvantaged communities, they could have targeted direct payments to those people rather than giving everybody a blanket discount of 30
Yeah.
cents a litre or whatever the number was.
Yeah. The other thing I think on public transport fares is this isn't actually good for public transport in terms of free public transport, right? Because the fuel crisis, the price signal was already strong to move from driving to using public transport if you've got that option, right? So it was
Yeah.
going to increase public transport usage anyway. And we're seeing that in states like Western Australia and New South Wales where they haven't reduced fares. Okay. So there's already a strong price signal. The other thing is that our public transport systems, there is a little bit of capacity typically post-COVID at peak times because a lot of them have not reached the same levels of patronage that they had during the week compared to pre-COVID. So there is sometimes quite a bit of capacity that can be used so they can absorb a reasonable increase in public transport. The problem with free fares as well, though, is it doesn't just get people out of their cars, it also stops people walking and cycling. And that's the historical evidence that we've had in Australia. So free trams in Melbourne stopped people walking and cycling. Lower fares in Queensland did the same. We don't get people out of cars typically with very cheap fares. We typically get people also out of walking and cycling as well as using public transport more. So what we're
But
doing is
Russell,
go on.
people will say, what about Victoria? All those people going out into the country and filling up overcrowding the trains over the long weekend.
Yeah, I mean, they could do that anyway, right? It's not a substantial benefit, and it's a very expensive policy that's poorly targeted. But it's also
I
very,
think that
but as we know, it's very popular, right? And in Victoria's case, they have an election coming up at the end of the year, a state election, and this is a very popular policy. So they will do well out of it, no doubt, politically. So it's another example, I think, of popular policy that's just not very.
well, we've got 6 months till the Victorian state election. Well, given that this is likely to go on for 6 months, you can't see them taking, like they've currently said, I think for the month of April, can't really see them taking it off in the lead up to the election. Can you?
No, I don't. I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it'll be very
So,
popular, and they won't remove it.
yeah.
And in fact,
So then
I imagine they'll have a pledge of free or very cheap fares post-election as well.
So potentially move to the Queensland model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interestingly, with Queensland, there's been an increase in fines for fare enforcement because people are going up 50 cents. Why I'll bother tapping on?
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic example of where things that you provide too cheaply or free, people don't value. And that's a significant problem we have in public transport in Australia. Is our fares are extremely cheap, but that comes with other problems. Typically, that our public transport systems are inadequate because we don't have the funding to expand them and make them, improve coverage because we're too busy subsidising the fares for people who do have access to public transport at the expense of those that are car dependent and don't have access to public transport.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, people who can afford it. So there's it's funny because I think generally we'd be, I'd be left of centre and you'd be right of centre, but it's something we both agree on that rich people shouldn't be subsidised to use public transport.
Yeah, I don't think rich people should be subsidised full stop. Generally, it's kind of which might sound for people on the left going, that doesn't make sense for people on the right. Normally they're like in favour of tax cuts. So I was like, I'm not in favour of welfare for the wealthy, and we have lots of policies that are welfare for the wealthy.
So we talked a bit about, wealth, and I think we both agree that both of these schemes would be better off in just direct payments to the people who are actually hurting as a result of this, for them to then make the choice about how they move around.
Well, I wouldn't have fare changes or even support for using the money they're spending on providing free fares. I wouldn't even provide it for the direct support. I would use the money that you've got from fuel subsidies for direct support. But it's nothing. I think I'd pay people just to come and use public transport again. I'd be using that money for investing in better services in the longer term. So I would say that, and in fact, even in the shorter term. So although we'll be close to full demand, full capacity at the peaks, I think there's significant potential to increase public transport use in the shoulders of the peaks relatively easily. And they could also do it at weekends relatively easily. Okay, because they don't need new infrastructure or new vehicles, and probably the drivers would probably welcome the extra shifts as well in many cases. And so I would actually say expand services at weekends so people can travel at the weekends, which they can't on public transport at the moment because often weekend services are so poor. And also, if people are able to retime, and I think the many companies would understand people's desire to retime if the public transport is very congested at peak times, as it will be, then retime into the shoulders of the peaks. Either turn up a bit earlier at work or come in a bit later as suits. I think that
Yeah.
would be a much better way of getting people onto public transport and utilizing the assets that we've got and getting people to have relief from the high fuel prices.
Okay. All right. So we've identified the problem. Where could the $2.5 billion that's going into reducing the fuel excise, or sorry, the lost revenue, where could have that been spent better? Let's talk about some positives where we could actually get some good outcomes from responding to the oil crisis.
Well, I think when you look at the COVID experience, cycling was one. So we could go and say, now's the time to roll out quick cycle lanes. And we know we can deliver high quality segregated cycle lanes very, very quickly in an emergency if we want to. Okay. And now would have been a good time to do that. The reason we don't do that, of course, is that there's people still driving around and it's very controversial to prioritize cycling over cars. And so
Yeah.
people don't want to politicians don't want to make that
And
viable.
this time around, you don't also have the benefit of remembered experience. So when the cycleways were installed during COVID, they were installed during very quiet periods while most people were at home. And when people started driving again through those areas, they didn't really remember what the road was like or what the congestion levels were. And traffic slowly built back up and people changed routes. Whereas now everybody's still out and about and busy. And if you suddenly, take out a parking lane or take out a traffic lane for a cycleway, because most people are still traveling to work every day or to school or to do shopping, they will see that activity and they'll know that it's impacting them right now.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting when you look at the lessons from the 70s is somewhere like Copenhagen, right? The reason it's one of the best cycling, if not the best cycling city in the world today, started in the 1970s with the oil crisis, right? So it had a long
I
term.
think Amsterdam would argue about that one.
Yeah. Well, I think Amsterdam's an interesting one because I think Amsterdam, if I'm correct, their movement started, yes, the oil crisis was important, but they also started with the sort of mother's safety for children movement as well, which helped drive their sort of cycling culture there. So I think a combination of those factors made a big difference. But Amsterdam and Copenhagen, certainly the oil crisis, made them turn away from car dominance towards more cycling, at least in the inner city areas. The suburbs are still very car dependent. So yes, I think some places may take the initiative in that space, and you may see the future Copenhagens and Amsterdams when we look back in 20 years' time going, well, that started at the fuel crisis in the 2026.
Yeah.
Not seeing any of
And
that in
then,
Australia, I have to say.
no, well, though, the politics of volume, if more people take up cycling, they will get agitated about how unsafe it feels. If they go, oh, it's too expensive to drive, well, I'll get an e-bike. And then they start riding the e-bike and have negative encounters on the road. That's where you can get political action, which may not drive change in the short term, but certainly in the long term. Anyway,
We shall see.
I'm telling you about politics.
Well, it's sound. I don't disagree with you, right? But I'm just not convinced that because the infrastructure is so poor in Australia that we'll see large numbers of people switching to cycling, even in the fuel crisis. I think they're much more likely to use public transport because we just don't have the cycling infrastructure. If they had the cycling infrastructure, we'd see a much bigger impact, but we don't. So, and we're not putting it in.
Yeah, though interestingly, a lot of greenfields developments from the 90s onwards have lots of shared path networks within them.
Within, yeah. The problem is that you
Yeah.
have to get out of the suburb to be able to get to the amenities that you want, other than perhaps a park. And so if you want to get to the shops and things like that, you tend to have to drive. And so unfortunately, they can't use it for the trips that they need to do for accessing the things they need to do for daily lives. So yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about road space. Let's talk about another bit of road space, and that's giving buses and maybe trucks priority lanes.
I would certainly go with buses. We'll talk about truck lanes, as a separate piece, but now would be a good time to put in dedicated bus lanes. And if you don't want to do a complete dedicated bus lane, then do a T2 or T3 lane and allow people to carpool as well. And just make sure you enforce it properly, because it will speed up the bus significantly. And now's a good time to in terms of attracting people to use public transport in the long term, making the trips quicker through bus priority is a really good investment now, which will pay dividends for decades to come if you keep the lanes in.
Now you've just used a uniquely Australian and New Zealand term there, which is T2 and T3. So
Okay,
high
yes.
occupancy vehicle lanes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
so we got, yeah.
So having 2 or 3 people in the car enables you to use the lane. Okay. Whereas if you're only driving on your own, you can't use that lane, which should be faster. So it
Yes.
enables the bus.
Yeah. Sorry.
And so it reduces the number of cars on that particular lane, but it enables people to still use it if they do drive, as long as they have at least one passenger in the car as well. So it softens the impact of shifting every car off the lane in favor of the bus. So it's a little bit of a compromise, but it does still significantly, as long as you get the numbers right, it significantly speeds up the bus still.
Yeah. Having been involved in the measurement of the performance of the T2 and T3 lanes in Sydney, I would certainly say T3 yes, T2 no, because they don't
and it depends on.
They don't drive behavioural change.
Yeah, and it depends on the dynamic, right? In terms of how many people do you have driving in your cars and stuff. Like, you've got to get the context right, okay? And I'd certainly say that, in many cases, I'd agree with you. Like, predominantly T3 would be preferable. So 3 people in the car.
Yeah. And it takes enough vehicles out of the way. So the benefit of bus lanes and transit lanes is you do have to create an impediment for the people who are choosing to drive themselves through choice, not people are doing it through necessity because they have a non-standard travel pattern. They have to feel the disbenefit of not being able to use the lane and seeing it relatively free flowing, or in the case of bus lanes, seeing that there's not many vehicles in it, but they're moving quite rapidly.
Yes. I don't think it would be a bad thing if people were sat in traffic in 2 lanes and watching the buses zip by, full buses, in terms of incentivizing people to switch. Okay, so that's the buses. You talked about trucks as well. What were you thinking?
Yeah, so the trucking industry, so when trucks are stuck in traffic, I don't know what the current number is, but I do remember one from when I was doing a lot of cost-benefit analysis many years ago. And if a truck has to come to a full stop, it costs about $1, probably $2 these days, to get it going again, to start rolling. And that's basically in burning fuel. So if you're worried about diesel supplies and the cost of goods, particularly food, then giving trucks the ability to keep moving can help lower those costs. At the moment, 0.5% of new truck sales in Australia are electric, 0.5%.
Yeah.
So
we have a way to go on decarbonising our trucks.
We have a really long way to go, and it's really important. But if we don't want the current cost problem to flow through, then we need to deal with freight, with trucking as a problem. And talking of subsidies, one of the subsidies that we could get rid of is the diesel excise rebate that is given to miners who are not actually moving anything on the roads. And so going back to the 90s when our fuel excise was actually used to pay for road maintenance. We have done a whole thing on this about how it hasn't been for 60 years. Miners and farmers are still given the excise back to them because they weren't using roads. So, and one of the big problems with electrification, and this is what Fortescue, one of the world's largest iron ore companies, is pushing, is take away that rebate, because it's actually stopping mining from electrifying.
We don't have the price signal.
We don't have the pricing. Yeah.
Because the question on the trucks then, because this is a really interesting one. One of the reasons that trucks often use our roads during peak times, increasing congestion, as you say, increasing fuel consumption, is that we often put restrictions on trucks in terms of the times of day they can make deliveries. Right? And we often do
Yes.
it for amenity reasons with people. But is this an opportunity to say, let's remove those regulations, at least temporarily during the crisis, okay, and enable trucks to be able to deliver, 24/7, and therefore be able to retime the trips that they're making and avoid the peak times, because it would then reduce significantly congestion and reduce fuel consumption as well, both for trucks and for cars. Would that be a sensible thing to do?
So that was done during COVID, because the trucks had extended delivery hours. So I mean, the freight electrification industry is pushing that, because electric trucks are quieter. But you have the noise. So there's two components. There's the vehicle noise. Sorry, three components. There's the vehicle noise. There's the refrigeration, if that's running. A lot of freight refrigeration is run off separate diesel generators. It doesn't come from the main power unit. And then you have the noise of the loading and unloading activity.
Not to mention the reversing beeping.
Yeah, well, yeah, a lot of them are moving to nicer sounds these days. More
Sleep
quacking
friendly?
rather than beeping. I don't know if they're sleep friendly.
Yeah.
Don't live next to a loading dock. But yes, but then at the other end, you also need to have people at the dispatching and receiving end. So you need people who are willing to work night shifts.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm not saying it's
Yeah,
easy,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right.
No.
But
So that's actually probably one of the more
I,
complex things is
I mean,
people who don't mind working in the middle of the night
well,
is
my other
actually
thing
more
is
of a
like,
challenge.
you made the point, right? How much fuel you lose just from stopping once, right? For one vehicle, right? Multiply that up across the entire supply chain, right? You're talking about potential diesel shortages, right? That
Yes.
is a huge, huge reduction in fuel use, which if this was if we had, if we do end up in a shortage as opposed to kind of a demand, surge, which we've had at the moment, then that's the sort of thing you've got to be looking at, hasn't it? I mean, you've got to be looking at every option to be able to keep. In Australia's case, we're so dependent on those vehicles for picking up stuff from the farms, from the farmers themselves, for then delivering that produce into the supermarkets. Our whole entire food supply chain is reliant on having diesel. If we run out of
Yes.
diesel, we're all basically looking to grow stuff in the back garden and hope we don't starve in the meantime.
Yeah, well, it's probably too late. You should have your garden now.
Now, yes, we're growing
Yeah,
all sorts of things in the garden
yeah,
now,
yeah.
just in case.
But
Not that
don't
we're
go
trying
panic
to.
buying food. Australia's going to be fine.
I look forward to, although I think you're right, probably. Right. I think this is one of those things where I'm like, I might just hedge.
Well, it's the freight event I was at last week. A former Air Vice Chief Marshal, and someone said, "Should we, stock up on stuff?" And he said, "No, it's too late because if you do it, there will be nothing left."
Stock up on fuel or stock up on food?
Groceries,
Yes.
both groceries and fuel. Yeah, it's too late. If you're gonna bed down a supply, you should have been doing it 6 months or a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's
Yeah,
hope it doesn't come to that. But
no, it's
time will
I don't know
tell.
why I'm laughing because it's not actually funny, but it's
Oh,
worrying. Okay.
it's
Okay,
possible.
so I don't see any moves to put in truck lanes or bus lanes yet,
No.
or even transit lanes. So last episode we talked about the challenges of non-transport people in charge of transport. Do you think this feeds into that issue, or is it a broader issue?
Well, here's my bet of what if I was betting right now. If I look at what our transport system is like now, okay, and what I think it will be like 12 months from now post crisis, I think it'll pretty much be the same. Okay, in the sense of we won't have used the crisis as an opportunity to significantly change our transport systems and improve them. And part of that is because we don't have a vision on what a better transport system looks like. And part of the reason for that is because, we have in places generalists in charge. And so their ability to understand why the transport system could be much better is limited. So, they're not going to be pushing for using the crisis as an opportunity to shift where we are. So, I don't have much faith that we will learn from this and come out of it in a better state than we currently are. So, for example, one of the policies we haven't talked about was in the 1970s, people introduced lower speed limits. So in America, they went down, their freeways went down to 55 miles an hour. And they've only actually recently increased in the last few years. And the research shows not only did it save huge amounts of fuel, because 55 miles an hour is kind of like the optimum for fuel efficiency, but it also saved thousands and thousands of lives on America's roads. We know that America's roads are the worst in the world. Oh no, sorry, the worst in sort of the rich world for killed and serious injuries. So, it delivers multiple benefits for lower speed limits and it's one of the things we could be considering globally is lowering speed limits in order to save fuel. I noticed the Greens in the UK have suggested lowering speed limits on motorways from 70 to 55 miles an hour.
Yeah, and I can't remember which country it was, but one of the countries in the Asia Pacific has asked their people to drive slower.
Yeah, I think we could have done, one of the things about, say, if we moved to blanket 30-kilometer-an-hour zones, which a lot of people have been advocating for, not for fuel efficiency reasons, but actually for safety reasons and to encourage people to walk and cycle. Again, my suspicion is it would significantly reduce fuel consumption and encourage people to walk and cycle instead and make our roads safer. So you'd save lives, reduce fuel consumption, improve health, right? It would be a policy that would be worth pursuing now if you had the politicians with the vision to do it. We don't. So I don't think it'll happen.
So we're not going to build cycle lanes, but more people are buying e-bikes. Should we could that, well, I know, the $2.5 billion could be used for so many better things. What about e-bike subsidies?
Yeah, the research on e-bike subsidies is really, I think it's in its infancy, but it's really interesting. So it does seem to shift people. When people purchase e-bikes, it does seem to get them out of cars, which doesn't seem just to happen normally for cycle lanes, but e-bikes, it does seem to do that. So it does seem to shift people directly. E-bike subsidies therefore seem to have very high returns on getting mode shift and reducing carbon emissions and improving the health of the people that benefit from them. And so for people on relatively low incomes where e-bikes could provide a good option, it might be a good way forward. The thing I would say, though, is, again, they're much more effective where there's good infrastructure. And the problem in Australia is in most locations in Australia, the cycling infrastructure is just not up to it.
Yeah. This is one where potentially the controversy over e-motorbikes, electric motorbikes that pretend to be bicycles, gets kind of interesting because they could actually make a significant difference to a commuter's life, that they would be able to get around much more easily if they, aside from the brakes generally aren't up to going at high speeds. Yeah, if you see kids riding around on e-motorbikes that are doing 50 kilometers an hour, well,
And the thing
maybe
is
there's
that
wiggle room for introducing them to adults.
Yeah, and the thing about the subsidies is that you would target them at lower power vehicles, right? You wouldn't, proper e-bikes as opposed to, as you say, motorbikes, right?
Yeah.
So, that's the thing is, I think when you start seeing where the consensus is coming on terms of the regulations of those vehicles, it tends to be focused around the power of those vehicles and therefore the speeds that they can go in order to regulate them. And the higher speed ones are not, shouldn't be classified as bicycles and being bicycle lanes, right? So,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now we talked a bit about free public transport versus increasing off-peak services a little bit, but I'll be a little bit controversial on this one.
Oh, something new. You've never been
Yeah.
controversial, Graham. What are you going on
Yeah.
about?
So, well, okay. So,
On. This is good.
yeah.
This is what I
Yeah.
think about
Well,
others.
so
Go on, throw the googly.
Okay. All right. Increasing off-peak public transport services is good in an electricity-based public transport system. 5% of the public buses in Australia run on diesel.
Okay, so explain why it's not good to increase off-peak services.
So if you're worried about diesel supplies for freight, increasing the number of buses the number of services that are being provided by diesel buses can eat into that supply. So I mean, we're talking very much worst case scenario here. We've already restricted sales of diesel to private vehicles, but if you're increasing off-peak services, then you need more diesel because we've been dragging the chain on getting rid of diesel buses. So in February 2026, there was 140 new buses sold in Australia. Only 40 of them were electric.
Yeah.
So we got 20,000 publicly run buses, vast majority of which run on diesel. So by increasing your off-peak public transport services, you're increasing demand for diesel.
Yeah. So I think this raises a really good, interesting point, right? So if we do reach a point where diesel is really short,
Yeah.
right,
We
are
need to cut back on buses.
we're going to need to cut back on buses, right? That's a really interesting piece. At which point it might make the case for cycle lanes would be really helpful right now.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah. And, I've been fighting the good fight on electrifying the bus network since 2016. People only have to look at my various LinkedIn posts about the dangers of diesel to children's health, about why the hell are we doing trials of electric buses in Australia, still doing trials. So one state and one territory government in Australia have made commitments that they will not buy diesel buses. And
Don't get me started. We did an episode on that stuff anyway. Let's talk about a positive thing. Another policy that I think would be positive was we could be doing
aside
more.
from that, in principle, yes, definitely increase off-peak public transport services.
We could also be encouraging more people to walk and cycle to school.
School streets.
That would schools, not just school streets. Slower speeds around schools, right? And walking and cycling in the streets around schools. There's lots of things. School buses, school cycling buses, and school walking buses. There's a whole bunch of levers that we could be pulling to decrease car use during, the school run. And we're not doing anything in that space at the moment in Australia.
Not really. No, though Australia has just released new guidance on how to get more walking and cycling to schools. But it's the challenge of different arms of government being in control of different policy levers.
It's partly that, but it's also there's a lack of political will, right? There is no political desire in this, right? Because if a state government wanted to do it, they could make it happen and they could incentivize councils appropriately. They just don't want to, right? For whatever reason, right? There is, again, it goes back to, for me, that lack of vision around our transport systems and why they need to change just doesn't exist at a political and often at a bureaucrat level as well.
And so one of the things we haven't talked about is actually avoiding trips.
Yeah, great point.
As a response. So, and interestingly, there has been a big backlash to work from home this time around. The business sector, governments saying, no, we're not going to encourage working from home, which given, the triple access planning, which, is a form of transport planning where the internet and its availability, and me in Wollongong and you in Adelaide to actually do this thing, that internet access is a form of access, would seem fairly obvious that if you want to reduce demand for fuel, you would encourage people not to make trips.
Complicated one, right? Because I think, if we end up in a proper fuel crisis as opposed to just higher prices, i.e. massive shortages, right? I don't think that policy will last, right? I think they will have to get people off the roads and get people working from home more. If we end up in it's kind of like crises have stages, right? And that would be one of the stages of where things are really bad. The reason there's much pushback, I think, on it is, especially if you're the government, I think this is true across the political spectrum, is there is a belief that because our public service are, I would argue now, work from home first and be in the office second at the moment, I think a lot of our major political parties, I think all major political parties, believe that has made public service worse. And it is not desirable for them to be working from home as much as they are. And therefore, they have been trying to get people back into the office to try and undo that and the damage that they believe it's doing. And that they don't want to do anything that undermines that push to get people back into the office and makes things even worse again. So I think that's partly what's driving that. I don't think it's the only thing, but I think it's one of the significant factors. And then and then although I think it's less bad in the business world, I think they also had struggles getting people back into the office and would like, in many instances, to have people in the office more than they currently are.
Yeah. Well, if you're paying expensive rent on an office, you want it used, don't you?
Well, I
Uh,
think there's more. I think there's more than that because a lot of them have been happy to take the opportunity to reduce their footprints, right, and save the money. I think that a lot of them feel like the cultural impact of having people in the office so little is significant, making the company, is harming the companies. So, and different companies take different views on this, right? And I think it also depends on. Yeah, I also think we'll see over time a sort of shuffling of the workforces depending on the different types of how corporates deal with home working. So if you're in your 20s, child free, okay, and you want to be, socializing and going out, okay, being in the office is probably a good thing for you. And you probably think, you probably want to be in the office and you want to be able to go out with your friends and mates in the evening afterwards and stuff. If you're in your 30s and 40s and you've got young kids who you want to pick up from school, take to activities, those sorts of things, home working is a great advantage for you, right? And so I think companies where they make that viable will attract people with families and people who would prefer to have the socializing option. Well, they'll attract people who are happy to be in the office 4 or 5 days a week.
yeah. Yeah, and I think it's when you get an imbalance between the two groups, particularly if your more senior group is in that latter group,
Well, I think what
and then,
we'll
and then the young people don't have anybody to actually learn from in person.
yeah. So I think what you could find is those earlier groups of people in the office, probably people post kids, the empty nesters, so mid-50s onwards, perhaps they'll be happy to be in the office again, right? And so you may find that there's a kind of gap between sort of mid-30s and mid-50s in those
Yeah.
organizations. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. I don't think we'll know for quite a few years to see how these things sort of work the way through.
Yeah. Well, before we get that, we can go back to the good old fashioned carpooling. Can we get strangers to share vehicles with strangers?
Well, so I think this depends. I mean, like we talked about carpooling before and the challenges with it, right? I think there's a lot of stuff that's, if people work in the same company, all right, we've talked, or they both at the same university together, for example, carpooling.
Community. Yeah, that's community.
There's some sort of community, right? And
Yeah.
this also
Yeah.
includes people who live in, say, the same suburb, may consider themselves, especially in more regional areas, to be part of the same community and therefore be willing to carpool. So you're hearing stories of people in regional areas who are increasing their carpooling to go visits to the shops, for example, so they don't have to do, two cars don't have to make trips to that. So it's happening anyway through the pricing mechanism of higher fuel prices where there's already community. I think where there is not a community, it is much harder. And all the evidence, and I looked at some evidence from carpooling for Lyft and Uber services, some research that was done, published, I think, in 2021, based on about 6 years of research around the carpooling for rideshare. And it had shown that actually it had doubled the amount of vehicle miles traveled and was actually really bad policy from a transport perspective. And that typically people came out of, when they did carpool, they did it off public transport, not from their own private car. So carpooling is hard to get it right and make it effective. It does work in some contexts. Do I think it's going to be a game changer for us? Evidence to date as such suggests no.
Have we run out of policy ideas? Do you think?
I think there's probably other things we could have discussed. I heard someone suggested to me that one of the things we could do is, as prices come down, is increase fuel taxes to compensate.
Well, there's billions of dollars that be recouped. Yeah.
Well, indeed, from a financial perspective, I'm sure all of the treasurers will be around the world will be going, oh, that sounds like a good idea. I'm not
Mm.
sure it'll fly politically. As fuel prices decrease, we're going to keep them high by increasing your fuel tax. I just don't feel it's an election winner. But if your fuel tax is very low, like it is in the United States, then perhaps it's an opportunity to rebalance it a little bit. But given that they haven't been able to increase it even at the rate of inflation for decades in the United States, I think the chances of them increasing the gas tax, even as prices come down, is, next to zero.
Well, that's the national gas tax. Different states have different
Yes,
taxes.
they do.
Yeah. 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 Okay. All right. Well, I think we generally agree on what we think good policy might be. Politics is going in a very different direction. Can we reconcile the two?
No.
What steps do you think we could take to bridge the gap? That was a big sigh.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago. It's a couple of weeks ago, no, maybe just last week, saying about one of the things I think that's missing in policy discussions generally, but including in transport, is we do not teach people to think in systems. We teach people to think in sort of small 1+1=2, cause and effect, without any feedback loops, understanding of solving problems. And as a consequence of that, people think very simply about the problems that we face in our world on a policy side. So fuel prices have gone up, just reduce them by reducing taxes. All good. Simple answer. Okay. It's actually much more complicated than that and has significant unintended consequences and feedback loops in it. But because people don't understand that, because they've been taught how to solve problems in a very constrained, single, point way, a very linear way, they can't understand that. And I think the reason I wrote the blog was, I don't think we can expect the electorate as generally to be able to tackle and understand system level problems if we don't equip them to tackle system level problems. And we don't. We teach them to tackle linear problems in our education system. And so why are we surprised when they vote for linear policies like reducing taxes, reducing fuel taxes and think there's no unintended consequences? So yeah, that for me is the fundamental problem, because if our electorate understood better systems and implications and thought about problems from a systems perspective, then we'd have a lot more people who'd be going, well, that's not going to work because you'll just end up with more people using fuel, and that might just make things worse. But people don't understand feedback loops because they've never been taught, those sorts of systems thinking in education systems. So yeah, that's one problem. We've talked about the generalist problem. See our previous podcast, okay, which requires
We've talked about the politicians and how they should be trained, I suppose, in understanding
yeah.
transport policy.
One of the
That's another
things,
podcast.
yeah, it is another podcast. I mean, one of the things I would say as well is, we have made the politician's job really crap, quite frankly. It's a shit job these days. Okay. And the consequence of that is that we do not attract the highest possible talents into running our countries and our governments, because less people want to do it, less people join political parties, etc. And the consequence of that is that we don't get as good decisions. We don't run governments as well. So when people are frustrated by, what our governments are doing, part of that is because we made our politicians' jobs so terrible in many ways. We're attracting less talented people. Result is we're getting less good decisions. So all of those things are compounding. There are a lot of things in the system that are broken, right, across the piece. And don't even get me started on, other aspects of our system that are broken around legislation and things like that. But we have lots of things that are broken. You can't pull one lever and fix it. You need to be fixing multiple levers, and that sort of level of systems change is really, really hard. So one of the things I'm focusing on at the moment is trying to understand, how do you get really significant systems change, predominantly from a transport problem perspective, but I'm also thinking about it more widely in terms of how we govern ourselves.
Yeah, it sounds very much like the 3.5% problem. You need 3.5% of the population publicly wanting to make change and taking action in order to make change happen.
Yeah, I don't know how well the numbers are researched and stuff and evidence based, but yes, we need significantly more people, recognizing that the system has got problems that we need to fix and wanting to fix them. And at the moment, I'll be honest with you, the people that want to fix that feel the system's broken, my personal view is that they're assessing in many cases what's broken. They're just not. They've got the wrong. They've misunderstood the problem. But that's just me.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great spot to end for this week. So thank you, Russell.
Thank you very much, Graham, as always. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. And if you want to help us support Hopefully you're liking the change in how it looks. Any money that you contribute will go directly into making the podcast better. You can do that on Patreon or at Google. Please like, subscribe, comment, and there's a new button on Google for emerging podcasts, which is Hype, which I don't know if it gets stuck under us. But anyway, thank you for watching or listening, and we'll see you next week.